It is absolutely the case that we face a challenging situation with regard to China now.
It's clear that the Prime Minister's foreign policy is a disaster and Canadians are paying for his mistakes.
If you don't have an ambassador, then that's a problem that an envoy might mitigate but will not resolve.
We are deeply grateful to the Government of Canada for its assistance and its steadfast commitment to the rule of law.
MPs made their debut in the new House of Commons this week, but old issues still remain, especially when it comes to the China file. And given the government is now without an ambassador there to walk the talk, how does it get that relationship back on track? What's the state of its larger foreign policy strategy? The At Issue gang is here to dig into that and some more. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Althea Raj is in Ottawa, and Paul Wells is also in Ottawa tonight. Good to see everybody. Let's start with the sort of the pointy part of this and maybe broaden out big picture. So John McCallum fired over the weekend. How quickly do you think, given the circumstances here, Chantal, the government needs to either replace him, think about this idea of sending a special envoy, do something to signal to the Chinese government that we want those Canadians released and that we are taking the relationship seriously?
Any of those solutions, I'm not sure that if we appoint an ambassador, the Chinese government in its current mood will be in a rush to recognize his accreditation as an ambassador. So that's question one. Special envoy, possibly, but all this, the angle on this in the House of Commons or in this conversation implies that Canada has a lead on this situation in any way, shape, or form, and that is not true. Nor does it actually have, at this point, I would argue, a China policy of any kind. It is a fact of life that Canada is caught between two big players, and until the extradition story plays out, it's not going to be fixing anything because it has been caught in a box.
Why we may be caught in the middle, I think that's fair to say, Paul. Is it fair to say that the government has no China policy or that they don't seem to know how to handle this country? And they're not the only government that struggled here, but how do you think this government's doing with that?
Chrystia Freeland has taken to answering questions about China generally with the specific answer that the highest priority is securing the release of those 3 detainees in China. That makes perfect sense. But all the broader questions remain. And I almost had the impression last weekend that John McCallum's crime was in guessing wrong about where Justin Trudeau's head is at on China now. Because McCallum was expressing basically where the Prime Minister's head was in early 2017 when he sent John McCallum to China. If trade with China has become more problematic, if the Xi Jinping regime has become more repressive at home, more assertive abroad, and that has changed the Prime Minister's entire calculus with regard to China, he hasn't said so. That's me guessing. I mean, that's me reading reports and publicly available news accounts over the last few years and guessing how things would have changed if I was Justin Trudeau. A new ambassador to say what? To take what stance? And as Chantal points out, would that person have realistic hope of getting their credentials accepted, within the next calendar year?
Because I think, Paul, I think what you were saying is that John McCallum was essentially appointed to that job to try and explore trade with China, and
he was the emissary of optimism, and we're in a moment of pessimism. I think more than a moment. I think we're in a new era of belated pessimism with regard to China. But once again, I'm guessing. Chrystia Freeland answers every question with these exquisitely hand-tooled talking points that say as close to nothing as she can get away with saying, and the rest of the government says less.
Yeah, and I mean, and you're quite right that the Prime Minister has not been terribly explicit on what we want from China at this point. Maybe there's strategy there. I mean, I don't know that you want to be talking at length about China as there are people being detained. Your thoughts?
Like
Althea?
what would be a strategy?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure what the strategy to keep quiet, right? To not try and provoke them further. I'm guessing as well as Paul here. Go ahead, Althea. Yeah.
They're trying to depoliticize the process while at the same time hoping that there might be a political out for them. And Chantal and Paul are right that John McCallum was appointed there with great hope and ambition, but he was also appointed there to signal that the Trudeau government took this relationship seriously. They were sending somebody that had the Prime Minister's ear, that was a former cabinet minister, and now the discussion internally, and I'm told that Chrystia Freeland is trying to come up with some recommendations to the government that could come as early as next week about what signal do they want to send to China now? Do they put in somebody new? Or do they leave the diplomat that's in there? Do they send a new diplomat? And what does that signal? Is that seen as a snub if they don't put a political appointee? Or does that signal that they're saying things are, we're a process-oriented country, we're just going to be, operating kind of below the radar? So basically everything is political, even though the government is trying to make it not political.
Yeah, go ahead,
But what is certain is that whatever Justin Trudeau hoped to accomplish and is China vision of 2015, that's gone. It's gone for the foreseeable future, not just for this month or next month. It's gone for beyond the election. Yeah. And I would argue that were a Canadian government, liberal or otherwise, decide that it wants to resume on that track, it has now become a really hard sell with public opinion.
What is it, Paul, that makes it so hard for this country and other countries, but let's talk about Canada, to get this right? I'm thinking about Stephen Harper and his on again, off again, hot and cold relationship with China. What is it that it just seems to befuddle us so much?
I find myself these days marketing a fascinating new book coming out next week by a guy I barely know, Jonathan Manthorpe, former foreign correspondent for the Vancouver Sun. It's called Claws of the Panda, and it points out that going back more than a century to Christian missionaries at the end of the 19th century, Canadians have often had a kind of an evangelical stance towards China. They figure that we can help the Chinese build the China of the future that they want, and in return they will be so grateful that they will cherish a special relationship with Canada. Okay. That special relationship is not getting closer. It's not even staying put. It's getting further and further away. China used to be, in 1970, Canada was China's 4th largest trading partner. In 2016, it was its 21st largest trading partner. We are vanishing from China's radar screen, except as a place to do industrial espionage, except as a pressure point to exert pressure on the Trump administration, and except as a fantastic destination in the lower BC mainland for money laundering. Beyond that, China can take or leave Canada. And it has taken an awfully long time for the Canadians to begin to figure that out. And again, I'm guessing. Prime Minister Trudeau has not told Canadians that he's begun to figure that out.
Okay, so let me just pull back a little bit and play a clip of Chrystia Freeland on a different topic this week, and this is this emergency meeting that they're going to have on Monday with the Lima Group to talk about Venezuela. Not so we can talk about Venezuela, but so we can talk about how that, or what that says about their foreign policy and what we are to understand about it. Here's what the minister said.
I would say that our work in the Lima Group, our work on Venezuela, has been one of our government's top foreign policy priorities since the summer of 2017. We've devoted a lot of time, a lot of effort to it.
So, I mean, that is true. They've sent a lot of money there. They've led this group, and they've tried to, this is now, I think, the second meeting here where they're trying to do something. Althea, what do you think it says about the government's approach to foreign policy overall, if we take these two events or others? What should we make of it?
Well, I think Venezuela is consistent with the government's approach. I mean, I think that foreign policy usually is basically an expression of domestic politics. We heard Minister Freeland express 2 years ago what she thought the government's policy objectives were on the foreign affairs file, strengthening multilateral organization, being that middle power with a little bit more strength. And here is an opportunity with Canada can play a leading role. I think it's important to note that the minister has, higher political ambitions, and this is something that kind of gives her something to talk about that is also perhaps a nice way to change the channel, not that they picked this particular timing, but it's nice coincidence. The Prime Minister, for example, today called the President of the EU. He spent time with the Prime Minister of Italy talking about Venezuela, strengthening Canada's idea on this file. So a migration crisis is huge. What's happening in Venezuela is probably the #1 issue in the Western Hemisphere. So it's, I think, a welcome opportunity that Canada embraces to kind of focus attention elsewhere.
Chantal.
But take note that if the Prime Minister today was called Stephen Harper, our stance on Venezuela wouldn't be very different from the one that's enunciated by Justin Trudeau. It's in a very different category from the Canada-US file or the Canada-China file, in the sense that it is our traditional middle power, let's try to be there and to play a role, as opposed to let's try to find our way in the world order. And the two games are, I find, divorced one from the other.
Well, it seems though, Paul, and I'll finish with you, that in this case they have a clear picture of what they want to do or what they think they can be. And in the other cases, whether it be with Donald Trump or China or even Saudi Arabia, it's things sort of happening to the government without knowing exactly how to manage it.
Yeah, I remember the latter months of 2015 when there was a new government in Ottawa that was fond of saying Canada's back. I think if you asked most of Canada's closest allies now, what does Canada being back mean? Does it mean a sustained engagement in peacekeeping? No, we learned today that the 1 year of helicopter reinforcement in Mali is going to be the only year of helicopter reinforcement in Mali. Does it mean being closer to the European Union or closer to Britain on the Brexit file? The signals change from day to day. Does it, and I remember a year and a half ago, Chrystia Freeland gave a detailed speech in the House of Commons explaining her foreign policy. And that was, it turned out, simply a sort of a marketing thing to demonstrate a precisely calibrated distance from the Trump administration. If Chrystia Freeland were to give another such speech next week, she would have at least as much stuff to talk about, and she would have at least as much mystery to dispel, because even with this hyperactive foreign minister, even with an increasingly engaged prime minister on these files, I think most Canadians don't know, they know everything's a priority. They don't know how these priorities stack and rank up. They don't know the trade-offs. They don't know the goals.
Okay. Got to leave it there. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Before we go, though, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, if you can get some extra content. This week, we're going to talk about this election meddling, foreign meddling in our democracy, what the government is trying to do to prevent it. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/